We'll still have a few people coming and going. I want to say good evening. Always wonderful to have you here. If there's still some left, tonight we have a yellow sheet, which we've done before, and there's a few of those left. We'll refer to that in a little bit. And then the other one is just an outline that says Daniel, his place in the history of the nation of Israel. For those of you who are online, once this gets downloaded, the outlines are usually up on the upper right-hand side, and you click those and you can download those. And especially tonight, it would be helpful for those of you who are watching this later, because it will be downloaded, and they'll be adding the outlines to it from there. We had a discussion about topic and what to do, considering both classes that we've done and where we're going. And with Wayne's guidance, we basically decided to go ahead and do the first 6 chapters of Daniel. And a part of it, tonight, part of this will be overlap. If you've been in some of the earlier classes, I'll just use the word review. There'll be some things that we'll review, we'll look at again. But a couple of other things I think are really important. One, we always have people who weren't in an earlier class, and so this will be new for them, so we'll go a little bit slow on parts of it. But the second thing is that as we come to the end of the Old Testament, and in fact, if you would turn to the back page of the yellow, to the square, up in that upper left-hand corner, and we're all in Genesis. We have number 1, before the flood, after the flood, the patriarchal period of time, which will start with Abraham, Egyptian captivity. They go down into Egypt. They wander in the wilderness, the conquest of Canaan, and the Judges. And by the time we do that, then we're just going kind of book by book, and it's just kind of straight narrative as it goes through. And as I said earlier, as you come toward the end of the Old Testament, it reminds me of those kind of megaphones that people use at ball games. You know, it's all just book for book as you go, and then it begins to increase both in volume and in number as you go on through, and we'll come back and look at those. But we'll start with the United Kingdom here in a second, which will be Saul, David, and Solomon, and just kind of roughly put those in order. But first of all, I want to look at some things in the outline, and again, something that we had mentioned. When I think of both studying and teaching from the Old Testament, I always think of 3 different levels. And if you look here at number 1, I'm going to start with 1:1, and I always just like to use Joseph because, Bill, I have some water, so I went ahead and got some. Thank you. And so you can go through Genesis 37 through 50 and just primarily read this and say, what does this tell us about the individual? Biographical. What does this tell us about the person? And that's just such an interesting story, and I'm not sure if this will be 2 or 3 of our second or third lessons. But one of the things that I want to do is to look at, and to me it's just this wonderful parentheses or bookends. When you finish the book of Genesis, God sends a 17-year-old boy, young man, however you want to call him, into a foreign land as a slave. And at a point in time later, we will talk about creating faith in our children. And I have a very clear picture, and those of you who've been in classes can tell I'm very visual and think about that. And this is now going on with grandchildren. But our kids from 1 to 5, I'm always conscious of trying to concentrate on their heart. God's good, worship's good, church is good. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Now, I'm not being cynical when I say this next thing, but let me just let you look back for a second. How would you describe a teenager with a bad attitude? Normal. Sorry. You get what you ask for when you throw it open on the floor. But you all know what I'm talking about. And if we have someone up to 5, at a point in time, if they live that long, they are going to become teenagers. So let's start anticipating and preparing that. And I'm really convicted about this. If we don't win their heart, we don't have to worry about the rest of it. And so from 0 to 5, every time I'm with our little ones, I can do things with them. And I told you, Each year, I'll try to take each of our grandkids to the fair by themselves. And, yes, we're going to look at baby chickens. We're going to, whatever their interest and their age is, but up to 5, we're just going to be specifically talking about God's creation and what God has done, and without any reservation at all. My ultimate purpose is to be winning their heart for God. 05. 6 through 12, then it's as they develop and they start being able to think, and you start thinking about how do we process things, where are things at. And Sheila, how old is Isabella? Pardon? 10. So I'm with our 10-year-old granddaughter, and this chart, I'm saying I want to draw a picture for you, and I want us to kind of talk about these things and where they fit together. And we never quit on the heart, but we now add and focus primarily on the head from 7 through 12. And that just becomes a really important focus, getting their thinking and their thoughts right. And then from 13 to 18, then we're thinking about their hands, what they do. Okay, grip in 4-H, heart, hand, and hands. And so very, very specific with that. But our firstborn was a boy, and one of the things in the back of my mind, and you would think, God forbid that this would happen, but if somehow Luke is taken from us at 17, would he have enough faith and enough trust and enough belonging in God that he would tell Potiphar's wife of his generation, how can I do this and how can I sin against God as a 17, 18-year-old? I mean, you talk about rationalizing. I'm a long ways away from home. Nobody knows where I'm at. She's probably an attractive woman. I'm a slave. You could rationalize all kinds of things. And at 17 to 18, this young man says, how can I sin against God and do this? And so in terms of developing faith in our children, like I said, Lord willing, in another context, we'll talk more about that. But like everything else, I think we should have a plan. We should have a purpose for doing those kinds of things. So here's Joseph, and then guess what? We come to the end of the Old Testament. Here's Daniel. And it's like 2 parentheses, 2 bookends. We're arbitrarily going to use the term 15. We don't know how old he is. We're going to find in Daniel 1, he is one of the young men. They have been taken captive. They go and they're put in very special learning situations. But I just want you to see this. Here's the biography. You can read and just say, what does this tell us about the person? The second level, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time tonight, you can go back to Genesis 37 through 50 and just say, what does this tell us about the developing of the nation? That great man of faith. And it started at 75. God starts saying, you're going to have a son someday. 75 comes by, 80 comes by, 85 comes by, 90 comes by, 95 comes by, and he's 99. And God says, and they have helped God, and I said this earlier, but it's still so true. This is a statement from Everett Hufford. They named the mistake Ishmael, God hears. And he says, every time as individuals and as a church, we start helping God, then a bunch of little Ishmaels start running around. But how old's Sarah? She's 89. He's 99. They're not spring chickens anymore. And God says, you're going to have a son. I'm going to make of you a great family. And you can look through the rest of the Old Testament on the second level above just the individual. What is God doing to build the nation and the family to fulfill this promise that he made to Abraham? And then the third one, the top one, and we'll actually spend a lot of time as we go through this particular quarter. And I think this is the one we should at times spend the most time on. What does this tell us about God? Because ultimately, God is the main character all the way through the Bible. And what is revealed as we read through Scripture is this unfolding of God's nature, his name, his personality, all of these various things. But it's not just done on Mount Sinai and we give them, things written on stone. It's done as God works with and interacts with people. So we've done number 2, but just notice this quickly. God promised Abraham, and here's the 3 things, descendants. And I put the term promised land. That's the term we use. I'm going to give you this land. And he tells them, I want you to walk the length and the breadth of it. And wherever the sole of your foot goes, I will give you this. And if you notice, Well, and then I will make of you a great nation. So here's 2:1. The promises begin with Isaac. And the mistake is called God hears, Ishmael. And our second grandson is named Isaac, and Isaac means what? He laughs. You mean we're going to have kids? At 89 and 90, we're going to have kids? And then comes Jacob and the competition between sisters and their handmaids and everything. And God starts forming a nation, and then here it starts. It goes Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. And then we throw in a little sister, Dinah, for good luck. Ladies, wouldn't you love to be the baby sister of 12 brothers? I mean, you just look at that and you think, oh, what a mess. And then eventually, God takes Levi out as like the firstborn that he does with the animals and the other stuff. And Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, then calls to be the 12. But then here is again God developing and working through his promises and developing this nation over a period of time. So 2:2, the land promise begins when Joshua crosses into the promised land, and they will do parts of this, but ultimately the complete promise that God gave to Abraham from the brook down at Egypt up to the Euphrates is not going to be fulfilled until the time of David. And as we're going to see, Abraham is going to be 2,000, Moses is going to be around 1,500, David is about 1,000. So it's going to take God nearly 1,000 years to fulfill the length of the land promise that he makes to Abraham. And then, while they are in Egypt this 400 years, then, and these are the statistics that we have to work with. As they come out, and this is 2:3, and you'll find this in the first chapter of Numbers, from the ages, and I think it's 20 to maybe 50, but whatever the fighting age is, then there are 603,550 men who come out of Egypt. So you start doing the figuring from there, and you say, okay, how many guys were younger than 20? How many men were older than 50? How many wives did they have? How many, you see what I'm saying? We know, we can count 603,550 men of fighting age come out, and you start adding all the other, I think there could be 3 million people come out of Egypt. Can you imagine? Can you just imagine being in charge of leading the state of Oklahoma toward California? Through, those scenic areas of New Mexico and Arizona, and what are we going to drink, and what are we going to feed these people, and on and on. That's what I told you earlier. This is just me. If I'm Joshua and Moses has died, and they say, Joshua, don't worry about a thing. We're going to follow you just like we did Moses. That's when I resign. I just say, God, let me out. I don't want any part of this. Yap. I don't want to deal with this. You just mentally think, mobilizing the state of Oklahoma, and you head west, and you're in charge of looking after them and caring for them. And this is what God is doing in terms of fulfilling all of these initial promises that he made to Abraham. So tonight, what we'll do is that we'll primarily look at the aspect of the nation as we kind of define Daniel and where he is. And what I want us to do is just kind of very clearly place Daniel within the chronological position that he is in the Old Testament. And what I have found through the years is that, and that's why I like to have a chart, and that's why I like to have little graphs to just mentally see where they are, because a lot of times we can just kind of read through the Bible, and we know that he's kind of toward the end because that's where it is in the narrated Bible. But we're going to try to give some very specific details and places. And tonight we're going to see Ezekiel and Daniel very, very close together. So if you look at the yellow chart just for a second, and just before Abraham, the V is Genesis 1 through 11, and if I had more space, I'd say universal history. Whatever God wanted us to know from day one down to Abraham is in Genesis 1 through 11. And obviously there'd be highlights, be a lot of details that would be left out. But the seed promise that God is going to make, that is going to begin in Genesis 12, is approximately 2,000 years before the cross. I can't remember if it was Daryl or Mark or one of the guys, but if you were here, we had one of the guys stand down there. And again, a marker. Abraham is as far before the cross, if the microphone is the cross, as we are after the cross. And again, that just helps me to kind of have some sense of context. And so I can kind of see where we are 2,000 years after the cross. So when I think of Abraham, then mentally, then I just go back and say, okay, when I study about Abraham, then I'm going to be 2,000 years before the cross. Some will put him in the 1800s or whatever. We're not going to quibble with that, but that just kind of gives us an proximity. Mount Sinai in Moses is approximately 500 years later. David, and you could draw a crown over David. And when we get to David, everything becomes within a year. Everything before, there's a little bit of, we're not quite sure. But because of all the external archaeology and stuff, once we come to David, everything is just within a year. And so again, this isn't too complicated for a 10-year-old. Okay, Izzy, when you go through and you read the Bible and you start going through this, now when you hear about Abraham, in your mind, and of course we're looking at this, put him over here, and then let 500 years go by, and then here's going to be Moses and Mount Sinai. Another 500 years is going to go by, and that's going to be David. And tonight, when we come to Daniel, then we're going to be in the 500s. So all of our major biblical characters are approximately 500 years apart. We're doing this, and her little brother, who's 8, came up and looked over my shoulder. He says, "Papa, a timeline, what's on it?" And I'm thinking, when I was 8 years old, I didn't even know if I knew what a timeline was. And plus, I didn't care what was on it. And so the little brother came, and I says, "Okay, now, Izzy, you help explain to your brother, what have we learned so far?" And do you see what I'm saying? And just while they're little bitty, we can start working on this. This is something for us to enjoy. This is something for us to learn, something for us to talk about. And we want to be able to talk about the people in the Bible like we talk about our relatives and our family. If any man is in Christ, he is what? Abraham's seed and an heir according to the promise. And so every time someone comes out of this baptistry and any baptistry today, then 4,000 years later, in Christ, we are the heirs, the recipients of this original promise that God makes to Abraham, and it goes all the way back. 931, the kingdom that's been together splits, and the northern kingdom lasts until 721. We'll look at the nations in a second. But our primary focus and interest is, and I will just always be appreciative of seeing this, because I would never have thought to do this. The Babylonian Captivity is a period of time when the people are living out of the promised land. And we'll look at these a little more carefully, but just notice them here. There are 3 times that people are carried into Babylon. 606, and this is when Daniel's going to be carried away. 598 is when Ezekiel is going to be carried into captivity. And then 587, 586, Nebuchadnezzar comes the 3rd time and destroys the place. And only a few poor people are left. And as we're going to see, Jeremiah, and you look over in the far right-hand side under the cross, there are 2 cases, Jeremiah 25 and Jeremiah 29, where God, through the Spirit, prophesies through Jeremiah, the people are going to be in captivity for 70 years. Now let's go ahead and do this while we're here. When you read Daniel 9 and 2, which we won't get to until later, but just look at this, Daniel 9 and 2, Daniel in captivity, 1,700 miles away, has a copy of the book of Jeremiah. And he starts reading through a fellow prophet, and he comes across this, and he finds out, wow, 70 years, we're going to be in captivity. Well, guess what? He was in the first group that left. And all he has to do is start, you want to do subtracting? All he has to do is start subtracting and say, this is when we left, this is when God brought us here, and at this point in time, God's going to start sending people back, and we'll see this in print here in just a second. One other thing while we're here, and we'll touch on this totally separately. The nations on the bottom are really easy to remember. And again, I'm doing this for our 5 and 6 year olds. The first three are in alphabetical order. And how easy is that to remember? So Assyria is going to be first, and the nation of Assyria is going to go into the 900s, but we just put the 900s in that period of time. And what we're going to find is that, like with David and Solomon, Israel is at a high point, and the kingdom goes all the way from the brook of Egypt down here all the way up to the Euphrates. And during that time, nations like Assyria and Babylon are not nearly as strong or powerful. And when God's people start sinning and Israel starts declining, then these other nations start growing and developing. And so Assyria is going to be the primary kingdom that interacts with. They're really the bullies of the ancient world. And if you'll do the 900s down to 612. In 612, the Egyptians come up, and the last of the good kings. And I always try to tell Josiah, don't go out, don't go out. And Josiah goes out to keep the Egyptians from going north. And the last of the good kings of Judah gets killed. But the Egyptians and the Assyrians fight the Babylonians, and they just get wiped out. They get decimated. And this is the Battle of Carchemish that we'll look at later. And so Babylon is going to be the controlling kingdom. And so when the 10 tribes are taken away in 721, they're taken away by Assyria. The few people who come back are the Samaritans. So when you come across the Samaritans, the Good Samaritan, etc. in the New Testament, then these are the people that are allowed to come back up in that upper part of Israel. And so our Babylonian captivity is going to last. Babylon's going to be the primary power from 612 to 530. So if you just want to make a note as well, sometimes the Babylonians are called the Chaldeans, Chaldeans, but we're still in alphabetical order. Assyria, BC, Babylon, Chaldea, and then the next group are either the Medes and or the Persians. And so those three kingdoms that take us through the end of the Old Testament, this is their timeline. Let me just give one other reference. We'll come to this later. When you see the 539, and we talked about this earlier, Belshazzar, who is actually the second in control, they're having a drunken feast. They have brought the vessels out from Jerusalem, and they're all getting drunk and everything's there, the evening's going on. And all of a sudden this hand appears and starts writing on the wall. I don't care if you're sober or you're drunk. If you see a hand that starts writing on the wall, that's going to get your attention. What are we going to do? Oh, well, there's a man named Daniel, and God's given him the ability. And so they bring Daniel in, and Daniel says, "Mene, mene, tekel, parsin." And what does that mean? You've been weighed and weighed in the balance, and you found wanting, and Babylon falls that night. And no one thought it would happen that fast. And so in 539, the Babylonians are going to fall, and the Medes and the Persians are going to begin, and within 3 years, they're going to start sending the Jews back, and that will kind of give us the time there. Real quickly, look on the other side. We'll see this in terms of books. If you look under time period number 10, this is when Judah is alone, and God sends 3 prophets to work with his people. Let me take a half step back and do this one other thing. Do you see under number 9, here's Isaiah. The northern kingdom falls in 721, right in the middle of Isaiah's prophecy. And again, a memory hook. Every time a major event happens in the Old Testament toward the end, God raises a major prophet. So just before, if we do 740 to 700 is the ministry of Isaiah. So 20 years before that, Isaiah is trying to tell the people, repent, turn back to God, and on, especially in the northern kingdom. They won't do it. It's like they close their ears. But here's Isaiah, and when the northern 10 tribes are taken into captivity, God raises that prophet. When you then move over Jeremiah, and he is going to be from 626 into the 580s, and when Jerusalem falls, God raises Jeremiah, and he is in the city of Jerusalem when Jerusalem falls. Your second major prophet, second major event, and as we've done with our small children, he is the weeping prophet, and so he writes a lament about the fall of Jerusalem, Lamentations. And then God then is going to send Daniel in 606, 1,700 miles away to Babylon. The second time that they come and they capture the city, 598, God sends Ezekiel into captivity. And so here's your major prophets that are going to work with God's people while they're in exile. So we call them major because of size, but I just think that's a helpful handle. Every time a major event is going to happen toward the end of the Old Testament, God raises one of the major prophets to help and to be a part of that. One other thing that's outside of tonight, but still just important to notice. When you look at number 12, the post-exile, our last three books of history, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, are after the exiles have been taken into captivity and they start returning. And the last three of our minor prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, are a part of this God bringing the people back. And let's just do this before we come back to our outline. This is still just stunning. God says to Abraham, from 75 to 99, you're going to have children, I'm going to make a nation of you. And all of these things happen, and the things take place, the people come into the land. And by the time Jerusalem is destroyed, God's people are more sinful and evil and wicked than the Canaanites were when Joshua came into the land. And you just can't even hardly imagine. But they have perfected the sinfulness and the evil, and they're actually worse. So geographically, watch what happens. With Joseph, and then through the famine, God sends the people into Egypt. He makes this nation of them, and they are delivered from the south. Let my people go, and they're brought back. They live in the promised land, united kingdom, divided kingdom. The 10 tribes are taken away, the Samaritans are back, and then finally, Jerusalem's destroyed, and then this time, instead of the south, God sends them all the way up the Fertile Crescent, up to the top, and down to Babylon, and they're going to live in Babylonian captivity. What Jeremiah, our weeping prophet, is going to be saying is that the day is coming when God is going to deliver the people out of the north country. God is going to bring the people back to this land from the north country. And what's going on? Oh, God promised Abraham 1,500 years ago, I'm going to make of you a nation. And as we go through, so we look at these individuals, and I'm confident this is happening in our lives. God is always doing stuff in our lives that none of us would ever be able to figure out and understand. And most of these people are just trying to live their lives and do what they're doing, and this is why then here comes the individual, here comes the nation, and God is involved in maintaining this promise that he's made all the way back with Abraham, and then here's God doing these things. At different times, all of us will have things happen in our lives that don't make sense. Why did that happen? And one of the last times I got to hear Howard Norton, he was at a preacher's retreat at Medill, and I'll always remember this. He said, I'm confident, if you know Howard, I love listening to him. Howard says, I'm confident that in this life, none of us will know what is the most important thing we did for God in this life. God may take something that we never could have imagined and do something with it that we had no idea about. And I'll tell you more about this later. Harold Shank, who is working on the last of the Hebrew commentaries in the series, non-churched, in Pennsylvania, poor family, and there were 4 kids here, 2 more coming. And if you don't go to church, you don't have a lot of money, and someone says, oh, could we take your kids to VBS? You can have my kids for VBS. And for 3 years, they went to various VBSs, but he said they liked to have us for the count for VBS, but no one invited us to stay for church. But he said, I kept going back to the Church of Christ because they had the best cookies. And so if you're a little bitty guy and you don't go to church and you go to these different churches, then you quickly figure out, well, let's make sure we find out when the Church of Christ is having their VBS because they have the best cookies. Mildred Smelter gets a hold of this boy in VBS, and she teaches him, and then she says, Harold, would you come to Bible class with us on Sunday? And it was like, are we allowed? Okay, poor family, don't go to church. We go to VBS because Mom wants to get rid of us for the week, and we get to have free cookies, and that was, And Mildred said, Harold, please come to Bible class. Sorry. Guess what his first lesson is on Sunday? Abraham. And as this little boy started having these questions about God and who is God and what's religion and other stuff, then they have their gospel advocate quarterlies and they sing their song and they do this. And Harold starts going to this church and they invite him to do stuff and he gets to help count and on and eventually becomes a Christian. And then one of these guys said, Harold, have you ever thought about going to a Christian school? And Harold's going, nobody in my family's gone to college. Harold, you should think about going to a Christian school. There's more of the story I can't get to tonight, but let's just leave it with this. Harold comes to Oklahoma Christian, and because he started studying Abraham, he then took Hebrew with Brother McCord, was an Old Testament major, spends a part of a year in Israel, goes to Hartman in Memphis, studies Hebrew with Jack Lewis, and does his degree and does preaching. They then go to Milwaukee to plant a new church, and everywhere he goes, he starts with elementary Hebrew, and he starts at Marquette, and he studies Hebrew, and he eventually writes his PhD dissertation on the sin story of Cain and Abel in the book of Genesis. And it all started when a lady said, Harold, would you like to come to Bible class on Sunday? You see what I'm saying? We're living our lives for God, and then none of us know on this other level what God is going to do with things that we would not have either the wisdom or the knowledge to understand. For maybe 20 years, Harold preaches for the Highland Street Church in Memphis, one of the largest churches in the South. Eventually becomes president of Ohio Valley. This hurts my head when I tell you this. In the 7 years he's president, for sanity, he writes 2 500-page commentaries on the book of Deuteronomy. I would need mental help to be doing that, but to maintain balance and perspective while he's raising money and other stuff, he writes 2 500-page commentaries about what God's doing in the book of Deuteronomy. He's finished Judges and Ruth, and he's now working on Chronicles. Now, why did we take this diversion? It all started when one lady said, Harold, would you like to come to Bible class? And see, as we read these amazing people in Scripture, we can see things that God is doing. But at the time, like us, they don't know how this is going to turn out. Okay? Paul Harvey, rest of the story. They don't know the rest of the story at that particular time. And so one of the things I want to encourage all of us to do, be faithful and leave the rest of it to God. But don't ever miss the opportunity to invite a small child to church. Don't ever miss an opportunity to say, we're glad you're here. And with our own, 1 through 5, let's win their hearts for God. Let's work on their thinking, how they adjust themselves, 6 through 11 or 12. And then let's start working with their hands. What can we do to serve God? And without any apology, evangelize our own kids. Before this COVID mess, I was able to, and I always try to take grandchildren when possible, so I took Benjamin with me to visit one of our members. And fair enough, as I will be someday, she doesn't have good memory on some things. And I don't know, 2 or 3 months later, something happened, and, did the preacher come to visit you? I can't remember. But somebody brought this 7 or 8 year old little blonde-headed kid. I remember that. So she doesn't know that I came. But she remembers a little 7 or 8 year old boy came. Our oldest, George, was 4, and he had this curly hair, and he was with us. And Ed Archer was in the hospital and had been struggling, but it was one of those things appropriate. And so I took George with me, and I didn't know this. Ed hadn't said anything for 2 days. And you walk in with a 4-year-old kid, and Ed says, hello, George, how you doing? And we visited a little bit and on, and finally George says, Papa needs to lead us in a prayer. And so we had a prayer, and we left, and the doctor told Sue, Ed's doing a lot better, go home, take a shower, everything's, everything's gonna be all right. Sue goes home, and while she's home, he dies. And Sue Archer comes to me and she says, I'm so grateful you brought George to visit Ed, because the last words I heard my husband say was, hello, George. And see, our kids shouldn't have to compete with us for God. Let's take them with us. Let's do things with them. Let's have this family where we do these things, and this is a part of God's family all through Scripture. That part was free. I won't charge you for any of that, okay? If you look at the main outline, the timeline that is on the first page, we have covered most of this, and this is just a brief review of that. And all I want you to see is that when we come to Daniel, we're at this particular time, the exile has taken place, and I'll leave you to read the rest of the details. They're all there. The one, though, that I do want to do is number 7, just about 5 lines up from the bottom. God says through Jeremiah, it's going to be 70 years, okay? Daniel is the first group of captives. They're taken away in 606. The handwriting on the wall takes place in 539. The Babylonians fall, and within 3 years, Isaiah, and we'll see this later, Isaiah calls Cyrus my servant, my anointed one. That's Jesus' words. And within 3 years, under the Persians, Cyrus says, go home. And the first group goes home. So you don't have to have a calculator. If you subtract 536 from 606, guess what you get? 70 years. In addition to that, the third time the temple's destroyed in 587, 586. They're in captivity. They start coming back. There's 3 different waves. They will start building and rebuilding the temple in 520, but the temple is finished in 516, and if you subtract 516 from 586, guess what you get? 70 years. So in 2 different ways, from the first group of people who are taken away until they first start coming back, then there are people in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And then once Solomon's temple is destroyed and burnt down by Nebuchadnezzar, then the people start trickling back under the Medes and the Persians. And in 516, they dedicate the temple, and the temple is rebuilt also 70 years later. I dare you to try to convince me that's an accident. And see, this is this amazing thing. Over and over, we see the hand of God working, and we all will have stuff happen to us. It's either not pleasant or why did that happen? And I'm just confident God's working and doing things in all of our lives that we'll only see in hindsight. And I do not mean to make light of our struggles, but this is something that's very true. We all will learn more about God from the rearview mirror than we will from the windshield. And sometimes from day to day, all of us will have things happen. Why did that happen? And this is what we're looking at. But at a point in time, in hindsight, we look back and we'll see God's working and doing things in our lives that we could never have planned and never could have done ourselves. So we're going to spend the balance of our time on the back. And these will be things we've looked at, so we'll just cover these fairly quickly. But I do want to look at this top one. We're not given the exact date of how old Daniel is when he's taken into captivity. I'm going to randomly choose 15. He could be 12, whatever, I don't know, but he's a young man, okay? And then if you notice this, he is taken into captivity in 606. When the first exiles start returning, that is 536, that is 70 years. So if he was 15 in 606, how old is he when the people start going back to Jerusalem? He's in his mid-80s. Now, the early part of Daniel's life is spent under the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar and on, but after the handwriting on the wall, then the decree to not pray, and when Daniel steps out and prays 3 times a day, he's under the Medes and the Persians, so that's after 539. And I mentioned this earlier, and I'm saying this respectfully. All of my flannel graph in Bible school, he was a young man. Okay? And fair enough. But, we all have certain memories of certain things, but I have these mental pictures through Bible class and other stuff. Here's this young man he's into his 80s, maybe older. And a part of what we're going to see, and here's our Joseph and our Daniel, sterling character. And when it seems the darkest night, and we'll talk about this with Joseph, I would be so angry at my sorry brothers to be in the prime of life and be rotten in jail at 17. I mean, guys, can you just imagine going to sleep and just how could this happen? I don't even know Egyptian. And here I am in a foreign land, and I'm sold as a prisoner. 17. Here's a young man. How old is Daniel? 15 or something. And it's amazing to me, with all of the unfaithfulness of God's people in various ways, that we have these just brilliant, sterling character, godly young men that form this parentheses in Scripture. And by the time that Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, he's an old man. But here's the encouragement. He's also a faithful man. And the same young man who won't defile himself with the king's food when he first comes to Babylon will not follow the decree to bow down and to not pray. And he remains consistent. And this is at the very end, but it's still important. We don't ever know he got to go home. Wayne, if you were 15 years old and you're being carried out of the city, do you look back at least once to see what your city looked like before you get carried off 1,500 miles away? Has the temple been burnt down when they take you out of the city? And this is where I identify Psalm 137. By the canals of Babylon, we hung up our lyres on the willow trees and the harps, and our captives said to us, "Sing to us one of the songs of Zion." Lord, how can I sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? But if I forget you, O Jerusalem, please let my right hand wither and let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I do not hold you above my highest joy. And a part of the purging of the idolatry and the immorality is that God sends these people into a foreign land, and when they come back, they have never been idolaters since then. And a lot of times when I read that psalm, I think of Daniel, Shadrach, and Meshach, Abednego. How can I sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? But they're faithful. And as we saw when we looked at Nebuchadnezzar's vision, which Lord willing we'll look at later, the center of prophecy moves from Jerusalem 1,700 miles away, and God's going to reveal through that vision what's going to happen over the next 500 years. But he doesn't tell anybody in Jerusalem. He tells that to Daniel through the vision and the dream. When you look at number 2, when the people come into the land, there's a series of blessing and cursing, and half the people are to be on Mount Gerizim, the other half on Mount Ebal. And I've done primarily the curses, but when you look at these, if you neglect the law, if you turn away, here's all the things that will happen. And you read through this, and I'm under number 2-3, the underline. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away. So where are we? We're 1,500, just after Moses. When's this going to happen? Well, to the people of Jerusalem, it's going to start happening in 606. So 1,000 years later, this is going to happen. I will take you away. I will cause you to perish. They will besiege your towns. You're going to eat your own children. We're just going to stop with that. It just, you read this section both in Deuteronomy and then in Leviticus, And then you let 1,000 years go by, and the curses happen to God's people. And Jeremiah will write nearly line for line, this is what happened during the captivity of Jerusalem. And then you go all the way back to when they first come in. And part of us are on Mount Gerizim, here's the blessings. Part of us are on Mount Ebal, here's the curses. And when they turn away from God 1,000 years later, then line for line, these curses come into their lives. So I'm down to 2:4. Jeremiah is going to record these things. And again, here he is in 2:5. And Jeremiah is going to survive the 3 captivities, the capturing of Jerusalem, including the destruction. They offer him what he wants to do. He wants to stay there. And my vote for one of the saddest chapters of the Old Testament in Jeremiah 44, against his will, the people carry him from Jerusalem and carry him off to Egypt. And the bottom line is, Jeremiah, when we were worshiping idols, and the ladies are saying, we made these cakes to the God of heavens, and our husbands knew that we did this, everything was fine until you came and started prophesying about God. This is your fault. You're just going to go, no. And he tells them, do not leave. And they force him and they drag him off to Egypt. And that's the last we hear about him. And no wonder he's called the weeping prophet. But look at 2:6. Daniel personally experienced the beginning of these fulfillments. And here again is Ezekiel. Number 3, Daniel's going to spend all of his time in the royal court. And that's the place that we'll place him, and we'll look at him. That's why we wanted to look at that. Ezekiel is the visual aid prophet. He's always doing an object lesson. And Ezekiel would probably bring an esky into an auditorium to let the bomb squad be able to make sure that we've done the proper procedures to be ready for that. But Ezekiel is the visual aid prophet. And all the time something's happening and he's shaving his hair or doing something. But he's among the people. So the same way God sends Joseph to Egypt, then here we are toward the end. Daniel, you're going to be in the royal court. Ezekiel, you're going to be out living among the captives. And God sends both of those prophets in that capacity. We have mentioned number 4, but here's the final one. It's 70 years. And you can read Jeremiah 25, 11 and 12, and then Jeremiah 29. And we'll be closing with number 5. And I love this. A prophet is reading a fellow prophet. I don't know any other cases where it's just that clear. But here's Daniel in captivity reading Jeremiah. Someone brings him a copy of the book of Jeremiah. And I'm in chapter 9, verse 2. In the first year of Darius' reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So this is what's significant. He's that young man in 606. He's carried away. He doesn't have to wonder. He was there. He knows when that starts. And so from 606, you start subtracting the time, and Daniel's able to calculate somewhere right about here, God's going to start sending people back into captivity. At this point, he doesn't know how, but that handwriting comes on the wall, and an entire kingdom falls. God causes a kingdom to fall, raises the Medes and the Persians, and within 3 years, the first group of people start going back exactly like God had said through Jeremiah. So here's our last 2. Daniel is 1,500 years after Abraham. And just let that soak in, okay? Back to that Sunday. Here's Abraham, 2,000 years before the cross. Daniel's going to be in those early 500s. 1,500 years after Abraham, Daniel is a member of the promised nation, but they're living in exile because of their sin. And then 1,000 years after Moses, Daniel experiences those initial curses that were given in that particular period of time. And this is what I want to see in terms of the nation, that God makes the promises and it's going to take him all this period of time to fulfill it. The ultimate fulfillment, and that's why we have the line from Abraham to the cross, the ultimate fulfillment is going to be in the coming of Jesus as the seed of Abraham. And so we are 2,000 years later, and we are still recipients and blessed by that promise. Abraham, through you I'll bless all nations. And our context of the nation for Daniel during that little box where they are out of the land for 70 years, that's where our godly man Daniel is. And Lord willing, we'll pick up with that next week. God bless and thanks for being here.